Serious, what's a fact about slavery that people may not know about? Ulysses S. Grant worked on his father-in-law's Missouri farm for a number of years in a period of financial trouble, and was often ridiculed for how kindly he treated the slaves. He received one as a gift from his father-in-law, named William Jones. Grant wouldn't force Jones to work, though, and within a year Grant freed him. It's significant because at the time, Grant was broke and struggling to support his family. The deed for Jones was potentially worth $1,000, which today would be around $30,000, and Grant never hesitated to free him instead of sell him. If I recall correctly, Frederick Douglass said that Grant did more for abolition in the US than any single person. Including himself. I also remember something about him waiting a year to free Jones was because filing for emancipation costed money that he didn't have. I didn't have. Grant is a really interesting dude. He graduated at the bottom of his CL butt at West Point and was selling firewood for a living before the Civil War. Also, every superior officer over the course of the war got infuriated with him because he would wing it way too often. But it worked so often that he climbed the ranks extremely quickly. Slaves weren't as passive as some historians would have you believe. A lot of them escaped and formed their own communities. One was called the Maroons. You see, now that is a fact worthy of this thread. Makes my heart feel good knowing some said duck it and duck off, and fucked off they did. You should absolutely read about Zumbi, a fugitive enslaved in Brazil. Founded a community of fugitives. We call it a Quilombo with over 10,000 people. Has remembered to this day, and there's a holiday in his honor here in Brazil. On July 8th, 1783, slavery was effectively abolished in the state of Massachusetts after the ruling by the Massachusetts Supreme Court in the Commonwealth v. Jennison case, where a slave named Quock Walker sued his owner for assault and battery. He argued that the Constitution of Massachusetts ratified in 1780 outlawed slavery. All men are born free and equal, and have the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties. By the time of the 1790 census, there were no slaves recorded in the state. Then Boston continued to Boston. The last surviving widow of a Civil War soldier, for financial/pension reasons during the Great Depression, died last month. The Civil War to end slavery in the USA was only 2 lifetimes ago. Wait. So some old Civil War vet married someone young in the 1900s, and they just died recently? 1930s. Yeah. For obvious reasons. The widow didn't tell anyone about the marriage until 2017. Only 4% of the total slave trade went to North America. If as a slave you found yourself in the Caribbean, then you were expected to last a year on average. That is mind-blowing, and this was reported by Samuel Jackson on his Black History documentary on the BBC during Black History Month. One thing I just recently learned is that as part of attempts to encourage them to assimilate, the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, were encouraged to own slaves. When they were forcibly removed to Indian Territory, they took their slaves with them. Related to that, when the Dawes Rolls were created, they were split into 2 groups, Indians by blood and freedmen, who were part of the tribe, because they had once been owned by it. But there were problems with this, chief among them, that it was done by white people off looks alone. So there were a lot of Afro-Indigenous people who were put on the freedman roll, and were consequently fucked over a little harder. When land allotments were given out, in some tribes the freedmen got a fraction of the land that the people on the other roll got. Even now, these descendants have to fight for their place in their tribes, and are often second CL but citizens in very real ways, able perhaps to vote but nothing more. Also, many tribes kept slaves long after the United States made it illegal. I thought it was common knowledge, but met another adult from a different region of the US that didn't know enslaved people were commonly given the same last name as their owner/enslaver/human traffickers. They thought it was coincidence that people of different races would have the same last name. I used to know a girl whose last name was spelled non-normally because after the Civil War their ex-slaves took their name. And damn if they were being associated with that. No one knows for certain where Spartacus came from, how he ended up enslaved by the Romans, or even what his real name was. A lot of historians think he came from what's now Bulgaria. The rebellion he led was less of a war against Roman slavery and more like a jailbreak that involved 70,000 men. The lullaby "All the Pretty Horses" is traced back to the days of slavery. The lyrics refer to a slave nursing her master's baby while her own goes untended. All the pretty little horses are the wonderful things the baby will inherit, so there's no need to fuss and cry. The song used to contain the lyrics, "Way down yonder in the meadow, there's a poor little lambie. Birds and flies peck at his eyes. Poor little lambie crying mammy." Slaves being wet nurses for white babies, while their own babies weren't given priority is so sad to me. As a mother who has breastfed 2 babies, it would be torture for me to go against my instincts and be forced to nurse somebody else's baby instead of my own. IDK if it's a fact. But apparently there's this kid on TikTok who found out that there's a Facebook group for the ancestors of slaves from a certain plantation they all come from. Through there his family was able to find cousin they never knew existed, and the people they aren't related to are still tied into their lives through one way or another. The majority of them also all have the same last name, even the ones not related to him, because that was the name of the old slave owners. This is actually really neat and a positive use for social media. Close to 2 million slaves died while on ships due to the extremely brutal living conditions. This is just so tragic. I know, right? And many were just thrown overboard if they fell ill. One of the worst things ever to happen to humanity. In the 18th century, Native American women would buy enslaved African men to free and marry because of the scarcity of Native American men in their villages. I'm a descendant of enslaved people from the Caribbean, and also a little obsessed with genealogy. Found out 3 things about slavery. 1. People who gained their freedom obviously also wanted the same for their families. They would actually have to become slave owners themselves by buying their family members. Releasing a slave would come with a pretty hefty fee, 250 guilders, the equivalent of €7,000. So sometimes they would buy and hold their family members until they were able to come up with the money to officially release them. 2. There were abolitionists, groups of Africa-born former slaves who would work hard, pool their money, and buy the freedom of others. One of them, Jan Houthaker, single-handedly bought the freedom of over 100 slaves according to Dutch archives. 3. I often thought slavery meant get sold in Africa, Middle Passage, work as a slave till death. I was taken aback to see that slavery in my family meant enslavement for generations long, for as far back as the records would show. Imagine a life with no alternatives. Depressing AF. Enslaved people would commit suicide by jumping overboard during the Middle Passage voyage. It's so cruel that dying on their own terms was their form of resistance. Generally speaking, slavery in West Africa, where the slaves were bought, was a bit different from slavery in the Americas. 1. Slaves generally worked in small, domestic tasks, not back-breaking plantation work. 2. From what I can recall, slavery was a bit more like indentured servitude. They would be freed after a certain period of time. 3. Children of slaves were not born slaves. Feel free to correct me on any of these. It was a typical custom to send young female slaves to the rooms of house guests late at night. Slave traders would rape female slaves. All of this was an effort to reproduce more slaves. Thomas Jefferson having children with Sally Hemings was not at all unusual, and most African Americans descended from slaves will have a significant percentage of lineage from Europe in DNA tests. There was a political scandal where Thomas Jefferson was going to be exposed for raping his slaves. Didn't work to end his political career because it was such common practice at the time. No one who was legally allowed to vote cared. Slaves were an investment in the antebellum South. As cotton production increased from the early to mid 1800s, so did the value of slaves. Most wealthy people then, as now, did not keep their entire fortune laying around as cash. They invested in property that would increase in value. The southern states' resistance to ending slavery was not just motivated by the economic value of the labor that enslaved people provided, but also by the fact that they would lose everything if their investments were suddenly considered people and not property. Edit, not defending slavery or slave owners in any way. Just wanted to share because I teach US history and I myself didn't realize this for an embarrassingly long time. People in the northern US profited off of slavery in the same way. Edit, the South profited more than the North. But people in the North profited in a more indirect way. This is often compared to people's 401ks now. Someone might be very against, insert bad thing here. They might vote against it, donate to causes opposing it, etc. but be benefiting from investing in companies that support it in their 401ks and not even know. Texas fought for its independence from Mexico to keep its slaves. Mexico abolished slavery, but also had a law respecting any contract made in the US. Texas slave owners took their slaves to Louisiana and forced them to sign contracts that they usually couldn't read, confirming their slavery. Texans went to war and won their independence in anticipation of the repeal of this law. Texas essentially fought 2 civil wars to keep their slaves, and they won one of them. Bad history about the Texas Revolution right there. There were many factors that lead to it occurring, such as the overthrow of Anastasio Bustamante and ending of the Constitution of 1824. Very few things in history have singular and simple causes. There are primary documents that explain how this was the biggest motivating factor for both wars. George Washington had slaves and was also brutal to his slaves. That one of the first slave owners in the Americas was a black man named Anthony Johnson. In fact, it was not uncommon for blacks or even freed slaves to purchase and own slaves of their own. Didn't black people often buy slaves so the slaves could live in better conditions? Yes. They would often buy back their family members or give their fellow people a better life under the guise of a slave/master relationship. In the US, laws had to be passed to prevent slave owners from dumping their elderly and senile slaves to die of exposure. People would literally work a slave to the bone and dump them on the side of the road to die. In Louisiana, one such law was the Code of 1806, and in Georgia it was the Old Age Relief Act for Slaves, 1815. Sounds like the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, coupled with companies like Walmart taking out life insurance policies on their vulnerable employees for profit when they die. When doing gynecology, I went to the National Archives and Records. They have old US censuses and landowner information there. On the census of my direct ancestors it showed 1 servant or slave. I about puked. Then I noticed that within a couple of censuses there was no servant or slave listed. Instead a free person of color. Then the land next to this showed the guy's name on the land title. And lastly it showed him, a female, and children of various ages on the census as well. My family apparently got an entire family out of slavery, but I'm pretty sure they wanted someone to have their back out in the frontier lands. I coined it the above ground railroad. That is awesome. Slavery is constitutional in the United States, but only as a punishment for criminals, which is how many prisons get away with forcing prisoners to work or pay prisoners less than $1 an hour for their labor. Most people didn't own slaves when it was legal in the US. Slaves were expensive. Slavery has been going on in one form or another for thousands of years. I find this really interesting. Sweden, for an example, didn't have a very active part in the transatlantic slave trade, not because we were nicer than anyone else. Most people were probably racist or hallucinate ways, but Sweden just wasn't very successful. But Sweden did have a lot of slavery involving mainly Swedish people. It was just a normal thing to sell your children as slaves if you didn't have enough money. Essentially, people have been shitheads for a very long time. They said thousands of years. The Vikings dealt in their own slave trade. You can still get slaves in the Middle East. Unfortunately, that part of the world is still living in dark ages. Just got lucky with oil. The colonization of Algeria actually had the benefit of ending slavery. The Barbary slave trade completely ended in 1830, when France took over Algeria. Many Americans deny that there are still cultural and individual ramifications from slavery and racism. You should see North Africans and Middle Easterners. They are not even taught about the Arab slave trade. They legitimately believe that slavery was not a thing in Islam. Europeans were also enslaved. Up to 1 million Europeans enslaved by North Africans. Still small compared to the number of Africans enslaved by Europeans though. Russia sold Finnish people to slavery in the 18th century. If we put it in proportion to population, Russia took more slaves from Finland than America from Africa. Did any of you know? Black babies were commonly used as alligator bait, so the slave owners could kill the alligators and juice their skin. A candy manufacturer created an advert featuring a hungry alligator staring at a black baby. The advert was called A Dainty Little Morsel. He named the licorice N-word babies, which was later shortened to nibs and can still be bought today. The Emancipation Proclamation was more of a war tactic than an actual act to abolish slavery in the US. The document only states to only free slaves in non-union states. Also, the North benefited greatly from slavery, especially in regards to textiles, rum, and ivory. I would highly recommend reading Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery. Not that many people believed me when I told them that slave owners would sometimes rape a slave. Edit. It was also illegal to teach a slave anything, so some kind masters secretly taught their slaves basic knowledge like math and stuff. Won't any sex with your slave be rape? Yes indeedy. Slavery is still legal and widely practiced in the US. Read the 13th Amendment, and please note the word except. Another one that's probably common sense, but blew my mind when I took our Intro to Black Studies course as a freshman. Antebellum law tied the condition of the child to the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the baby was born enslaved. Because slavery was tied to race, this meant if the mother was enslaved, she was black. So the baby was born enslaved and black. This created an incentive for white slave owners and men in slave-holding households generally to rape enslaved women in order to increase their labor force. And if you go down the line and do this for 10 generations or so, then the child who gets born enslaved and therefore black based in the condition of the mother may not look black at all. This is how you get photos of early black abolitionists who look totally white. And it's the origin of the one-drop rule within the US. Slavery, and therefore race, was conferred via the status of the mother. Widely. How widely in a country with 350 million people? It's the prison system. Dude. So yes, widely, the US incarcerates people at the highest rate in the world. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe for more videos.